Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Hall, and I'm the President and Vice-Chancellor at the University of Victoria. I want to begin today's discussion by acknowledging land and language and pay my respects to the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory UVic stands, and also to the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich people whose historical relationship with the land continues to today. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and pledge to walk the path to reconciliation together. It's my absolute pleasure today to host today's event on housing. It's an issue that every single one of us in British Columbia is meaningful to. We're very privileged today to have two of the province's innovative ministers to join us for today's sessions. First, I'd like to introduce the Honourable David Eby, our province's Attorney General and Minister responsible for housing. Over his career, Minister Eby has championed issues related to housing, including as a former advocate for the Pivot Legal Society, where he worked tirelessly to protect the human rights and dignity of homeless and underhoused residents of Vancouver's downtown east side. Welcome, Minister Eby. And it's also my pleasure to welcome back to our campus the Honourable Murray Rankin, who serves as British Columbia's Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. And prior to this role, he served as the Federal Member of Parliament for Victoria and was a law professor at the University of Victoria, and a finalist for Maclean's hardest working parliamentarian. Today he joins us in his role as a member of the Legislative Assembly for Oak Bay Gordon Head. Welcome, Murray.
Thanks very much, President Hall. Great to be with you.
So welcome everybody to today's town hall on housing. It's an issue, as I said, affects many of us in the greater Victoria area, in our community and beyond our community. In particular, it affects those with lower income, students, seniors, people with disability, and Indigenous peoples. And over the last number of years, many of us have seen housing prices rise at alarming levels, not only here in British Columbia, but across the globe. Stable and affordable housing is a critical component of success for our students, for our community, and for the region. And finding solutions to the housing challenges here in the Greater Victoria region and across British Columbia and beyond will be an all hands on deck approach. Here at UVic, we're looking forward to the completion of our first building in the new student housing and dining project this fall. The new buildings are being constructed to the highest possible environmental standards using passive house design. And more importantly, upon completion, we'll provide 783 campus beds for students, which is a net increase for us of over 620 beds. But this is only one small piece of the puzzle. And with over 26,000 students, staff, and faculty, we're really keen to continue to work with partners, both the government and the private sector, on further expansion opportunities. And that's why we're really thankful to have both ministers here with us today to talk about housing policy and where we may be headed as a province on this critical issue. As part of today's discussion, we also want to hear from you. For those of you who have pre-submitted questions, thanks very much. These questions have helped tremendously in developing our topics for discussion. And during our event, and if you have additional questions, you can do that through an online platform called Slido. Additionally, through Slido, we'll share some of the polls, and we would love for you to participate in those polls. So to access Slido on your mobile device or computer, go to Slido, that's slido.com, or with your cell phone, you can open up the camera and focus it on the QR code on the screen. Once you're on the web page, you'll be asked to enter a code. So type in CGRO. It's not case sensitive. And if you have any questions for today's discussions, you can enter them under the Q&A tab on Slido. If you see a question similar to the one you're planning to ask, you can upvote it by clicking the thumbs up icon. Upvoting questions will not only bring these to the top of the queue, it'll show us how important this question is to the collective audience. Please be respectful with what you post and remember not to share any personal information. So let's have a warm up with our first poll. On your screen, on your Slido screen, tell us, where do you call home? Is it Saanich? Is it Victoria? Maybe Up Island, the Lower Mainland? So we'll give you a bit of time to all get into Slido, and we'll see where the numbers start coming in. So great thing about Slido is you can see this in real time. Probably no surprise, most people here from Lekwungen territory, Victoria, Saanich, Fernwood. Any surprises there, Minister Rankin, where people are coming from?
Not a bit.
So it seems like the bulk of our attendees here are in Saanich. The size of the word tells you how many people are coming in. Somebody's coming from their car. Thanks for joining us from your car. Now, hopefully you're pulled over. We've got somebody from Kamloops. It's fantastic. All right, so that's given us a good indication. Thanks everybody for your responses. And really that's just a teaser question to make sure we can all use Slido. So that's fantastic that you've all managed to sign in. So MLA Rankin, I'd like to ask you first, from your point of view as an MLA, what actions are being taken within the region to address the housing crisis? And from your work, how is the province addressing issues around Indigenous housing?
Well, thanks very much. And I'm too in the Lekwungen territory here today at the Ledge. And I suppose I should start by saying I have a chunk in my role as Oak Bay Gordon Head MLA of Victoria, Saanich, part of it anyway, and Oak Bay. So I want to speak to each of those areas. And then your second question on Indigenous housing, I'll turn to that afterward. I want to start by saying that it's been great to meet with the UVic Students Society, talked a lot about some of the same issues that I see have come up, and I'm really grateful for that background. You know, I think it really depends what municipality you're in to start with. I think it's fair to say Victoria's made some pretty significant strides in densification. They've taken a lot of steps on supportive housing and homelessness response, but Oak Bay has a fair bit of distance to go, to be candid. I've advocated that they deal with the secondary suites issue that I know many of your students will have faced. They're illegal technically in Oak Bay, although thousands of tenants live in these secondary suites. And of course, if they do, they don't have the benefit of the Residential Tenancy Act protections. And so I've advocated that there needs to be a change. I believe that that's coming up in the next few months. Finally, there's been a lot of studies in Oak Bay, but there has to be some action, and I'm going to continue to advocate for that. Saanich has just in the last little while adopted a housing strategy. There's something like 73 actions. A lot of it deals with rental, and I think they're really in a good place. They're moving in a good direction. On the homelessness front, there, you know, I'm happy that really close by to UVic in the Mount Talmy area, there's a shelter that was established in collaboration with Saanich, BC Housing, and it's taken people who were living in the Save on Foods Memorial Center and given them a more permanent structure and a step, I think, toward more permanent housing and recovery for some of Victoria's unhoused population. So I'm really happy with that. I've had an opportunity to meet with every single one of the community associations in the riding, and that's given me a good sense of what can be done, where the communities are as we go forward. And I think the inevitable need to densify. I know my colleague, the Attorney General, will talk a lot about that need as more and more people are choosing to live in our wonderful part of the world. I should say again that UVic, you've mentioned, President Hall, about the 620 plus new beds that have been created. I think that's a jump of about 25% in the student beds at UVic. And I'm really proud that our government funded that. I think it was about $98 million that was made available to the university to bring this to be. And I know that's going to make a big difference. We've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go. Let me turn to your other question about Indigenous housing. I think it'll surprise some of the law students and political science students here to know that before I got elected, when Mr. Eby was around as an MLA, the government decided to put $550 million in funding to Indigenous housing and on and off reserve. And I stress that because the federal government, of course, is 100% responsible on reserve. But the government said, look, it doesn't matter whether you're in a city or you're on reserve, there's an obvious need to be met here. And so that $550 million is built about 1,750 units. So there's work to do. That's part of the 30-point plan that I know Mr. Eby will tell you about. I can spend more time later on that topic.
Great, thanks, Minister Rankin. Thanks for your honest answer. And it sounds like a tremendous amount of activity going on locally here and across the South Island. So thanks for that. And I'm sure there are going to be some questions to pick up on some of the topics you raised. So Minister Eby, I know from the advanced questions, our audience was really interested in the work that's being undertaken at a provincial level to address housing. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the framework that's been built and where the province is heading.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Kevin. I'm joining you from the territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people here in Vancouver. Thanks for having me virtually to join this discussion. It's great to be with you and the students today, and with my colleague, Minister Rankin. What I suggest that I'll do is maybe just provide some high-level areas that the provincial government is working on. And then we can spend most of our time answering the questions that obviously the very informed audience has. Some of the questions were quite fantastic. So that'll be the bias in terms of speaking time. Just to maybe, I'll set up a bit of context about why I think we're in housing crisis right now, and then talk about how we're addressing toxic demand in the housing market, how we're going to address supply issues that we're facing, and also some of the work, as Minister Rankin mentioned, around homelessness and supportive housing. The context for housing, and it's important to know that in the 90s, the federal government stopped building housing. A lot of the large rental housing buildings that people live in across the province were built under a federal tax structure called a MURB or a MERP. These were tax structures for the business students that allowed an accelerated capital cost depreciation. And a lot of investors built large-scale rental housing. The West End of Vancouver, for example, was built mostly out of MURBs. They stopped doing that. They stopped funding the provinces to build housing. And in 2001, the province of BC stopped building housing. For example, they only built 150 student housing units in 16 years after 2001. And so we accumulated a very large deficit of affordable rental housing, where government used to be involved and the market just won't build it. And now governments are getting involved again. So the federal government is back, and we hope there'll be a significant housing budget coming from them. And certainly the provincial government is back, and I'll talk to you about some of the work that we're doing on that. That's part of the context. The other part of the context is the pandemic and the really intense things that have been happening in terms of readjustment of where people work from. Across the province, real impact on small and rural communities that haven't seen growth in a long time, have a very limited housing stock, and people are moving out to these smaller communities to work remotely. That's one example. A lot of seniors who traditionally would have been moving out of single family homes into retirement downsizing kind of homes are reluctant to do that because of COVID. And British Columbia, since the start of the pandemic, has seen an increase of 50,000 people, whereas Ontario saw a decrease over the same period of 25,000 people. So people are moving from other provinces to come to British Columbia. In the last 3 months of last year, which is the most recent quarter that I have data for, a net 25,000 new people are now calling British Columbia home. About 5,000 of those folks moving interprovincially to BC, and about 20,000 moving internationally to BC. That's a 213% increase over the 10-year average for in-migration from other countries, and a 90% increase in in-migration from other provinces. There's a bunch of reasons for it. Federal immigration targets, in terms of interprovincial migration, our schools are open, lots of economic growth and opportunity in the province. But the bottom line is a huge number of people coming, and projections of 100,000 new British Columbians every year for the next 3 years. So really a perfect storm. Increased demand for housing, more people, and a legacy of a shortage in housing. So that's where we are currently, and that results in a feasting for speculators, people who see an opportunity. There's a gap between the demand and the supply, and they can profit by flipping and buying investment properties and so on. We see REITs, other investment vehicles benefiting from this kind of structure. So what are we going to do about it? What have we done about it? On the toxic demand side, we've seen a couple different discussions about that. International money coming into the housing market. We doubled the foreign buyer tax. We put in place a speculation and vacancy tax. If you're keeping a place vacant and you're not renting it, you pay a very high rate of property tax. CMHC tells us that brought 18,000 units of housing back onto the market that were previously vacant. The revenue we collected from that is building about 4,000 homes. We have 32,000 homes under construction that we're funding directly through government. They're either complete now or they're in development. We've supported the development of 5,800 student housing beds since 2017. At UVic, it's a 25% increase over the previous level of student housing, with a 600 plus bed development for UVic. And I do want to underline, that at UVic, at BCIT, at just those single schools, we're building 2 or 3 times the same amount of student housing that was built in the 16 years between 2001 and 2017. I find that so shocking. I wanted to say it twice. Okay, so in Victoria, outside of student housing, we have more than 1,200 affordable homes, rental homes under construction. We're redeveloping the Capital City Centre Motel into more than 400 new homes, including supportive housing, low-income housing, and affordable rental housing. We have another development on Johnson Street, on Douglas Street. On Douglas, it's 153 2 and 3 bedroom home. So there's lots of projects like this that are going on across Victoria and the CRD. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between municipalities, but we are committed to building 114,000 units of affordable housing over the next 10 years. And we are a third of the way in terms of the units that are already funded under construction. And we're halfway in terms of the units where we've made funding commitments and they're still in earlier stages of development. For renters who are already in housing, a lot of this pressure is coming down on renters around the shortage of housing. What we see in jurisdictions like ours, where there's more demand than there is housing, is that low-income renters get pressured out of their housing, whether through redevelopment, landlord tactics. They want to get them out and get somebody in new who's paying a higher level of rent, these kinds of things. So we banned illegal rent evictions. We've capped rent increases. We had 0% rent increases in the first part of the pandemic. We allowed a 1.5% rent increase most recently this year, so a 0.75% rent increase over the 2 years. We have a compliance and enforcement branch. The previous government had put this in the legislation for an enforcement team around rental issues, but they didn't fund it. So there was no team, although the law existed for it to be able to exist. So we funded the team, and now they're doing investigations and resolving issues around illegal evictions of tenants, and also around tenants who are committing fraud. Because if you're wanting to rent out your place, you want to know that if someone is going to come in and destroy your house, and that they've done this to 5 other people, or they're going to steal money from you or not pay their rent for 6 months, you want to know that there's some accountability for that. And so we want to assure people who want to rent that the government will help them address issues like that as well. So it's landlords and tenants that are addressed through the enforcement team. We have, for those families that might fall behind and risk homelessness because they're living month to month, we are the first province in Canada with 100% rent bank coverage. Rent banks are a lot like, to me, they're a lot like food banks in the sense that this is not where we want to go, just like shelters. It's a stopgap. We know that it's going to take years to bring the rental housing supply on that we need. And in the meantime, we need to support families who are in private rental housing. Just like food banks, we need to support people who are in food insecurity, even though these are not the desired solutions to these issues. And then finally, around homelessness. Province-wide, we've housed more than 3,000 people who were previously homeless in supportive housing. We have another 2,300 units underway. 300 of these units are under construction in Victoria. During the pandemic, we housed hundreds of people out of the encampments in Victoria by buying and leasing motels. Again, not an ideal response when you're talking about people who are living outside, but getting people inside so that we can provide support. And I'm really glad that we did, because we decamped the encampments in Victoria just before the Delta wave of the pandemic that really hit hard in the unhoused and marginalized communities in both Victoria and Vancouver, and helped avoid, I think, a catastrophic result, both for individuals, but also for the healthcare system and the city as a whole. So just a really good and immediate example of how housing people saves money and saves misery, and makes a lot of sense. Even if you're not sympathetic to people living outside, it makes a lot of sense to do it. I happen to be sympathetic to people who are unhoused, as well as recognizing that it provides great benefits for the public to house people and support them in housing. So those are the big themes. I did skip over, pardon me, I missed on the supply side. One of the big challenges that we face is our relationship with municipalities around recognizing the volume of demand for housing and the length of their approvals processes. In some municipalities like Oak Bay that do not approve rental housing, they just won't do it. And so the challenge that we face is For other types of infrastructure, for schools, for sewage, for you name it, municipalities are generally required to cooperate with the province to deliver that infrastructure. Housing, for some reason, has been different. And I'm really hoping to advance a shift in that conversation where it's, you don't get to say no to the housing that we need. It's essential infrastructure for the future of our province, and the costs of not building the housing far outweigh the impacts of adding additional residences. But cities do have an important role to play in saying, where do we want the growth to be? What are the heritage areas we want to protect? What do we want the housing to look like through official community plans? So we have funded cities to do housing needs surveys about what the growth will be in communities. We're supporting them in developing official community plans that match that housing demand that's coming. And we also have an expectation that they will have zoning that allows that housing to go ahead. And that they can have those internal conversations about how to do that, but that it must be done. And that's where I would like us to stand up. I'm currently engaged in a lot of conversations internally and with municipalities about this. Some municipalities are very much on side with this kind of approach because it's climate justice. It's about making sure people can live close to work. It's about making sure that people have a place to live. So it's social justice as well. But it also makes sense from an economic framework and the growth in the future of the province, just with the number of folks coming here. So there's lots of exciting things going on. I can't wait to hear your questions, and let's see what people are interested in hearing more about.
Fantastic. Thanks, Minister Eby. And one thing that strikes me just listening to you is there is an incredible amount of activity going on, but also that this is an extremely complex issue with many, many different issues and multiple layers of issues that really need to be solved in a sort of a continuum approach. So thanks for that. And so now we will turn to the questions. And I would say, you know, in registration, we received over 50 questions from the audience, and that's fantastic. So thank you, audience. So we're going to spend the next hour going through some of the questions that you asked when you registered, but also we've got our live poll open. You can submit questions to the live poll. We'll get to some of the live poll questions in another 20, 25 minutes or so, but we're going to start off with our first question. So we'll bring that up on the screen. I'll read it off so it can be translated by our ASL interpreter. Thanks, Heather. So our first question: how will the province work with municipalities like Oak Bay and Saanich to increase the supply of student housing? So who wants to tackle that first?
I'll take the first high level, and then I'll let Minister Rankin talk about the local level that he knows best. So at a high level, if you're a real nerd about this stuff, there are two reports. There's the Development Approvals Review Process Report, the DAPR report, which is about how municipalities move from somebody who wants to build a new housing unit through to finally approving them to be able to go ahead and start construction. There are provincial approvals sometimes required, there's municipal approvals required, and generally most people agree that that system's not working very well. It can take 5 to 7 years in major centers to approve a new rental building. And by that time, construction inflation and other factors mean that what used to be an affordable rental building is no longer. So accelerating that process by dealing with unneeded hearings. For example, we allowed municipalities to not do a public hearing where the official community plan already allows them to do a certain kind of building in that area, because the public already weighed in on the official community plan. You don't need to have hearings for every single site following that. It's one example of streamlining that process. That's the DAPR report. And it's freely available online if you're interested. The other is the Opening Doors report. And the Opening Doors report is a joint federal provincial panel that looked at the issue of the shortage of housing in British Columbia, and identified this issue around municipalities, the length of approval process, and also the fact that some municipalities are just not approving housing. And so we have funded municipalities to do these housing needs studies. Our expectation is, my expectation is, I believe the government's expectation is, that municipalities are finding ways to approve this housing, that they understand the housing crisis, that we need their support to allow the density, to accelerate the rental buildings and the affordable housing buildings. And at the end of the day, if municipalities are not able or not willing to hit those targets, the report suggests that government could limit access to government grants that are associated with additional density, whether it's transit or some other kind of funding. So the reports also suggest that government could fund essential infrastructure. Often municipalities are concerned about, how do we pay for the sewer? How do we pay for the amenities, the parks, and the other things that make life livable in more dense communities? And so those are the conversations that we're having right now through my colleague, Josie Osborne, with the Union of BC Municipalities and across government. But we're looking very closely as well at jurisdictions like Washington State, California, New Zealand, Massachusetts, where governments have set out targets, requirements. You must hit these, you must get your plans approved. As potential models for us, because this is a crisis that has gone on for too long. So that's the high level piece, and I'll turn it over to Minister Rankin in terms of his particular knowledge of Saanich and Oak Bay.
Well, I think that's great. And, I think it's really a question of carrots and sticks. I think that's what I would summarize it as. We can provide incentives. We can fund those infrastructure projects to build on what Minister Eby said in those areas, in those municipalities where densification policies are underway. Conversely, if they don't wish to do that, then that money will not be made available. We need to be thoughtful about how we do that, because we don't want to interfere with what is municipal decision making, the how, where, and kind of housing that they want. But the need for all of us working together to increase supply seems to me self-evident now. And I think every municipality, certainly Saanich, Victoria, and Oak Bay, have to bite that bullet. And that's what we're trying to say. Hopefully they'll come to that conclusion on their own. But as the minister said, there's other jurisdictions where more assertive stances have been taken. I hope we don't have to go there. On a more positive example, go to Redfern Street, really close to UVic, parallel to Foul Bay, just near Oak Bay. It's a cute little street, and there's several laneway houses or garden housing, however you might want to call it. People have different names for it. I happen to think it's beautiful. I happen to think it's a possibility of infill in areas like Oak Bay that would be really well received. Another example in Vancouver is, let's say an area is zoned single family. So only single family houses. Okay, maybe you won't be able to build high-rise apartments, but what about 3-story or 3-suite type of places, infilling on properties or just a little bit higher? Toronto's doing some of that, Vancouver's thinking of that. I think we need to provide more creative options in the housing market. I think we got to figure out how to incent that kind of work. As UVic, for example, with the 600 plus new units that we've created for student housing, what does that mean to the rest of the market? Well, it means that there's more supply available in what would have been occupied by students. And as we deal more with more supportive housing or seniors housing, again, you free more of the market for everyone else in an increasingly urban environment. We have to recognize that, and we have to make sure that the incentives are provided to ensure that that can happen. And that's why I've been outspoken on the secondary suites piece in Oak Bay, because I just don't think that makes sense. I don't think it's right for students who don't have the benefit of the Residential Tenancy Act. And we all know that it's massively taking place anyway. Why don't we legalize it? And I'm hoping Oak Bay will see their way clear to do that. Thanks.
Great, thanks for that, Mr. Rankin. Thanks, Mr. Eby. Let's turn to our next question. So the next question is, what actions are being taken to lower rent costs in Greater Victoria?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there's a couple pieces to this. One is I have regular meetings with Mayor Helps to discuss the initiatives in Victoria that she's working on. One of the things that I really appreciate is Victoria has been quite aggressive in taking up the offers that the province has made around streamlining processes. So around the approval of affordable housing to reduce the number of hearings, reduce the approval times, and also to upzone and allow large high density rental buildings. I think Victoria understands the connection between climate and affordability and housing, as well as homelessness. People sometimes, I think, disconnect large-scale encampments, visible street homelessness, people living in cars from other types of housing, but they are all incredibly interconnected. When you build a large rental housing building, even if that building itself, it does not have rents that are affordable to lower income people, the people who move into that rental building take pressure off of middle and lower income rental housing. There's a lot of really positive research about how this opens up and takes pressure off lower income rental housing, because if that building isn't built, the people with the higher incomes bid out the middle income and lower income people from what rental housing is available. And then you see the increases in homelessness and so on that we've seen in places like San Francisco Seattle and other American jurisdictions, and frankly, in Vancouver and Victoria. So, so that's at the municipal side. I'm really happy with what Victoria has been trying to push ahead and had some success doing. At the provincial level, one of the things we're doing is we're helping fund this construction of additional rental housing and improve the affordability of market rental housing that's being built. We have $2 billion in a fund called the Housing Hub, which provides loans to people who are building rental housing, either nonprofit organizations or for-profit developers. That construction financing, because it's much cheaper than what you could get on from a bank, the delta or the difference between those two interest rates allows for the contractor or the nonprofit to deliver more affordable rental units and to commit to deliver them in exchange for getting the funding. So we have a couple Housing Hub projects under construction in Victoria. We have more than 4,000 units in development across the province. And these Housing Hub models are great because we provide the financing, it provides the affordability, it gets the building built. And then once the building is complete, the owner takes out traditional mortgage financing and pays the money back to the province. And then we can put it into the next project, which again speaks to the importance of getting those approvals done really quickly so that the building can get built and the money can come back out and it can go into another more affordable rental housing project. Another piece is around where we can find units that are either held vacant or used for purposes other than rental housing. So we have the supply and vacancy tax that looked at those empty units and brought those 18,000 units back on. But we also are doing a lot of work with the Union of BC municipalities on short-term rentals. So there is a shortage of hotel rooms in Victoria and Vancouver. There are very good profits that can be made by doing short-term rentals through Airbnb and VRBO and these companies. Rather than renting out to a long-term tenant. Municipalities are trying to restrict that activity and make sure that rental units are used for long-term rentals rather than as vacation rentals. We just received a report from UBCM that outlines their proposal for how we can support municipalities in doing this work, and we're doing the policy work on implementing that right now. So Airbnb is the only company that's been voluntarily sharing data with municipalities about who is renting through their platform. Which allows municipalities to enforce their rules. Otherwise, it's very hard for municipalities to know who's renting through these systems and avoiding municipal rules around it. So there's a lot of work to be done there. But at the end of the day, in the rental housing market, the big solution is to build a lot more rental housing because the demand is massive. As everybody who goes to UVic knows, the demand far exceeds the available rental housing. So we need to be building those units.
Right, thanks.
Could I just add a little piece on the Saanich front, if I may, President Hall?
Absolutely.
Because I noticed when you had the initial slide, you saw the majority, the biggest number, of course, were students that are living in Saanich, which of course makes sense. Everything that Minister Eby said is absolutely true, and I think increasingly relevant in Saanich. He talked about, the good work underway in Victoria. And the speeding up the approval for affordable housing and rental housing is one of the key pieces there. That's exactly what Saanich is trying to do. They just approved a 4-year funding plan for what I talked about earlier, their housing strategy. And among the things in that housing strategy is support for rental housing to incentivize, they call it, developing new purpose-built rental housing. And I think that's really important because that'll benefit students a great deal. Of course, the other thought is that the more supply we're creating, as I said earlier, the more, like, for example, there's been about 1,250 affordable houses that have been developed, paid for in Victoria, either in development now or already complete since 2017. Of course, that's also going to create more supply, and therefore we hope the rents will go down as we have a greater supply. It's sort of economics 101. So let's hope that proves true in this circumstance as well.
All right, thanks for those answers. We'll move on to the next question. So will British Columbia follow New Zealand and California and change municipal zoning codes to enable broad upzoning?
Thanks for this. So the jury's out. Our approach to date has been to try to find cooperative ways to support municipalities in increasing density. I think we've had some success with some municipalities and we've not with others. I've got a hit list, greatest hits list of the housing projects that have been turned down even just in the last 3 months. There's a 115 unit rental building in Penticton that was turned down by the local government, and the Chamber of Commerce said, please don't turn it down. We're desperate for that for rental housing. And they did anyway, because the neighbors said it would affect their lifestyle. There's a 6-story building for adults with developmental disabilities in Surrey that was funded by BC Housing that was turned down because the mayor said that it was his feeling that the building was too tall and incompatible with the neighborhood. And on and on. The District of North Vancouver turned down 50 rental housing units because they wanted them to be more affordable, not taking into account the fact that the 1-year lag between the next public hearing and now would have 20% construction inflation, and the units would be even less affordable because they weren't approved. It goes on. And the other frustration I have is in the fact that single-family homeowners, people say, oh, why don't you ban single-family zoning? I'm not interested in that. I think that we should allow people, if they want to build more units on their single-family lot. There's a lot of seniors who are house rich and income poor that I think would be willing to strike a deal with a developer to turn their house into multiple units where they could live in one that's more size appropriate for them and live on the passive income of the rents from the other units, or even sell them as strata units to people that would like to live in that neighborhood. And in many communities, that's not allowed. As Minister Rankin said, Vancouver just announced a pilot program with 2,000 homes that'll be upzoned to 6 units. In Victoria, the mayor is working on missing middle income housing and using a similar model as is City Council. So there are promising leads, but I won't hide my concern that preventing people from building housing on their own property when we know there's an interest for it and when it would help deal with the housing crisis isn't something that I'm interested in. So finding ways to encourage municipalities to do this voluntarily is where we're at right now.
Okay, great, thanks.
I just found it interesting that the attorney used the expression hit list, and then he said, no, I mean greatest hit list.
Yes.
That sort of sounds like carrots and sticks
hits
mixed together. Greatest hits versus hit list. I think that captures nicely the carrot and stick thing I was talking about earlier. But in all seriousness, in Oak Bay, I can confirm that it's exactly what seniors are telling me. They live in a house that's now who knows how expensive given housing price inflation, and they're house rich, but they don't have any they're living on a fixed income. Mm. I mean, obviously, what the attorney just said is such a clear solution to this problem that we should encourage this for all sorts of reasons. And so I can confirm that's exactly what seniors in my riding are telling me.
Right, thanks. I think if you look globally, there's lots of examples of exactly doing this. I've just come from 8 years in Australia where, land prices are crazy compared to here. Average price of a house in Sydney now is 2.8 million. And it's very common now to take your house, knock it down and build 3 units, strata units on your property, live in one and either rent or sell the other 2. And, these are really well done developments as well, that they're not, they fit the characters of the neighborhood. So it'd be great to pursue that. Our next question. Why has the government not partnered with universities to aggressively increase on-campus housing or mandated all universities must house a minimum of 50% of the students?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one that maybe should have been asked 20 years ago every year. We are partnering aggressively with universities now and have been for the last 3 years. We have either completed or under construction 5,000 units of student housing at UVic. We're increasing the number of student beds by 25%. We're catching up from 15 years of no student housing construction. And one of the things that we are running into is capacity in the ability of contractors and so on to provide the housing at reasonable rates. And so we're running the construction industry pretty hot right now in British Columbia, including the housing construction industry through various government programs and also through the private sector. So we have lots more work to do. some universities and some post-secondary, some colleges would not need 50% housing for students. There's, I know for UVic, this is a situation where UVic students are in an area where rental housing is very limited and there's huge demand and very low vacancy rates. Not always the case. Thinking of it as a provincial viewpoint, one of the areas where we've been focusing sometimes in more rural communities is Indigenous student housing, so that Indigenous students have a place that's appropriate, culturally appropriate and responsive to their needs, with elders and so on, that helps support Indigenous students in their success in post-secondary schools, especially in northern communities where people are coming from very remote reserves or remote communities to a bigger town for the first time, and it can be quite a different kind of cultural experience. So housing looks different in different communities, and but I appreciate the sentiment. I agree 100%. We need to be as aggressive as possible around housing and get that housing built. And that supply of rental housing for universities is going to reduce pressure on students and the financial stress and the stress of finding a place, and it builds community, and I'm a huge fan of it, and it saves money on transportation, saves emissions. There's so many good reasons for us to do it. So we will continue to do that work, and we are doing a lot of it. I just want to reassure you of that.
Great.
Maybe I can tell a quick little story. Just tell a quick little story about UVic. Before President Hall, you came on board, the former President Jamie Castles and Minister Rob Fleming sat down and talked about the very difficult point that the minister has just raised. How come the BC Liberals in their 16 years of office built only 130 student housing beds in all of British Columbia? How come? Well, the answer was very simple. Universities are what are called government reporting entities, GREs. And so the debt for building like student housing shows up on the books of the university and therefore on the books of the province. And in an era where balancing the budget meant so much to the last government, there was no incentive to build housing. In fact, there was a disincentive to build housing on campuses. President Castles, MLA Fleming, as he then was, figured out that needed to change. And that is exactly why we have the new housing that we've talked about at UVic today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mr. Rankin. And I certainly, can assure everybody on the call, the university is working very hard with the government to address our housing issue. And I think it's going to take multiple solutions across many different aspects, of which on-campus housing is certainly one of them. Our next question. With many being priced out of home ownership, particularly first-time buyers, what is the government doing to address fair market in BC for all home buyers?
It's a great question. So I think for too many young British Columbians, they don't see a route to being able to buy a place, and so we've had to do a few things, and we will continue to do our work on this. But the key to it, the core of it, is that we need to have sufficient, and I feel like a broken record, but we need to have sufficient housing supply for the folks, not just who are moving into British Columbia from other provinces or from other countries, but as people who are living at home, or they're living in a student residence and they want to move out into their own place, or they've been renting for a while. They're also increasing the demand for, so I talked about the 25,000 people, net new people in just 3 months that are looking for a place to live, but add to them all of the people moving out of their parents' homes, looking for a place to buy, everybody competing together. In December of this year, we hit the lowest number of listings in the MLS service, the Provincial Real Estate Listing Service, that anyone has seen in the last 30 years since we started collecting data. So we have a record population boom over the last 10-year average, plus a record low number of home listings for sale. And I hear people talk about interest rates, oh, if we had higher interest rates, that would solve. What higher interest rates do, and what the stress tests do, is it limits the number of people who can afford to buy, right? That is what it limits the number of potential buyers, because you can't afford the interest rate, you can't afford the down payment, you can't afford the requirements of the stress test. And so therefore you can't buy. And so housing appears to be cheaper, but actually it's available to less people. If we want people to have an opportunity to buy, we have to build homes for them. And homes get cheaper the more you build on expensive land. So if you build one unit on an expensive piece of property, that is a very expensive home. I can't believe it. I mean, Kevin, just 1 sec. I just need to say some things here. Since I've been saying that we need to build more housing, the number of academics who have come out of the woodwork, no offense, to say that I am wrong, that I am off track, that this is a mistake, that we need to do more study, whatever, is just remarkable. And to me, that's very confusing, because if the idea that upzoning or providing more density decreases affordability, then the most affordable areas of our province should be the single family neighborhoods, should be the Oak Bays. In my community should be Point Grey, Shaughnessy, Dunbar, because these are very low density. You can only build a single family home communities. Those should be the most affordable, but it's not. The affordable areas are where you can build more units on the property. And the most affordable areas are the areas where you can build lots of units on that expensive land. And so I don't want to oversimplify. We need to address the toxic demand and the speculation and the investors who are just buying and flipping properties and whatever, that froth in the market. But a lot of that is a symptom of the fact that we've been underbuilding housing for a long time. And sometime, Kevin, I hope that we can set up a debate or something about this, because I just shake my head. Globe and Mail article, Tyee article, article after article. I say we need more housing, and then there's a line of people who say, "Oh, I think we should study the problem for longer," and I just don't understand it.
Well, thanks, Minister Eby, and I will take up that challenge. We'll get together a debate panel. I think it is a great debate. Can I just ask, as a follow on to that, increasing the density on land obviously is one of the solutions on expensive land. What's the role of less expensive land? And I'm thinking, if you look at what they're doing across Europe, it's building, low-cost housing further away from a center, but providing really high-quality, high-speed transit. So it's almost like you don't need to live right in the city if you can be there in 15 minutes. Is there a role in this area, at least, to look at some of the lower-cost lands by bolstering the transportation systems?
Could I just maybe jump in on the local front and then invite the minister to talk about it in more global terms? There is an environmental component that needs to be taken into account. Yes, if we had functioning high-speed buses and the like, and maybe occupancy lanes that are solely for buses or cars over with 3 people, like the HOV lanes in the Vancouver area, that might help. But without that, all we're going to do is incent urban sprawl, and we're going to create a contribution to greenhouse gas emission. And transportation is the largest component of and I know people listening in will be concerned, as we all are, about the implications for climate change. So it's interesting when you used your example of Europe, you started by saying, functioning transit. And although we're making great strides in transit, there still are some problems in our local market to deal with that. But I just want to put that aspect out.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And of course, Europe is known for its electrified train systems and electrified buses. So yeah, Mr. Eby, anything to add to that?
And thanks for that. I think one of the dangers of presenting at a Vancouver or a Victoria housing forum is to oversimplify the housing issues across the province, because it's a great big province. There's a lot of land, and there's a lot of different communities that face different challenges. I just wanted to take a quick second to take your question and maybe just address some of the unique problems in other areas of the province, just by way of information, things that I've seen. So in Prince Rupert, the port there is growing quite dramatically. They're adding hundreds of new workers every year. Obviously, international trade, picking up supply chain issues, the port's only going to be more important. And it's got some challenges around building muskeg and kind of rocky turf and infrastructure that's really old. They still have wooden pipes in some parts of the city for water management, sewage, so on. And so their issue is they don't have developers. When I talked to Jen Rice, who's the MLA for North Coast, when I talked to the mayor and Council of Rupert, that and the Port Authority, they would love to have people come and building housing there. And the land is relatively affordable. And you could build affordable housing, market housing that could be afforded by the folks who are working in Prince Rupert, but there's just not the developers there to do it because it hasn't been growing for a long time, but now it is. And so that infrastructure just simply isn't there. In some really small communities, they have the site, they are ready to build affordable housing. The land is, they own the land, but they don't have the $1 million to tear down the old school that's full of asbestos that's on the site that they want to build the affordable housing on, or they don't have the money to build the road to the school, to the site, or the water connection to the site to build the affordable housing. So in Victoria, Vancouver, CRD, land price is a huge part of the affordability question. In other communities, it's significantly different. And transit is a big piece of this. So one of the things that you've seen from our government is a dramatic increase in support for transit, especially during the pandemic when people stopped riding transit, just to maintain the level of service that people need to get around, even though ridership wasn't supporting it in the same way. Huge investments in rapid transit, certainly in the Lower Mainland and out the Valley, to get people around to support expanding populations. And in the CRD, expansions around transit funding, new routes and new buses. So it is absolutely part of the solution. And one that's been really challenged by the pandemic. A lot of our plans around transit and TransLink's plans and BC Transit's plans have been challenged by the fact that people stopped riding buses for a year.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. All right. Let's go to our next question. And just to remind people, if you do have a question you'd like to ask that you haven't pre-submitted, you can ask that at slido.com, #CGRO, and just put it in the Q&A section. So our next question is, how do you see we can achieve more cooperative housing for seniors, families, and working people? And what is the present government position?
This is a really good question, and actually very timely. So when I told you about the federal government used to be involved in housing and isn't anymore, they about 50 years ago were very heavily building co-op housing, and a lot of those co-ops were built on 50-year leases or 60-year leases, and those leases are coming up now. So they didn't actually own the land or buy the land outright, they leased it for the co-op. And so we're seeing issues across the province, and actually there are issues across Canada of these co-ops losing the land that they're built on. So it's a very significant issue. The thing about co-ops that's really positive is obviously the community building aspect and the shared responsibility for the building. It's a different way of organizing multifamily living. The thing about co-ops that makes them more affordable, people look at co-ops, they're like, wow, that seems like really affordable. Is a co-op. Co-ops, something about the structure must be that co-ops are more affordable. What makes those co-ops more affordable is that the government of Canada funded the co-op, and they paid for significant aspects of the cost of the co-op, and that affordability carries on because of the federal government investment. And so that is the opportunity for us and the BC government. So our policies are around land ownership by government, by the public, or we're looking at and experimenting with land trusts and covenants around properties that are owned by nonprofits or others to ensure that that affordability carries forward. In terms of co-ops, I'm a big supporter of that particular governance model. But I think that the focus of government right now is on preserving land, on preserving the affordability of the land and the units, and building as much housing as we can. And we do work in partnership with the Nonprofit Housing Association and the co-op folks on this issue of the aging out of the federal co-ops. But current government position, I guess I would say in favor. And then beyond that, this is a structure that different nonprofits or others who are proposing housing for government funding can bring forward, and that we do fund.
I'd just like to add just one tiny footnote, harkening back to something that Minister Eby talked about earlier, and that is the fact that the federal government for years and years has been absent from the field. And now, happily, they are re-engaging, and we hope in a meaningful way with real money in the budget coming up and the like. But this policy really connects up very nicely, the whole issue of incenting cooperatives with the federal government. And let's just hope that that governance model becomes an important part of their package of things that they bring to the table.
Thanks, Mr. Rankin. And for those of us on the call who are interested in getting the federal government more involved, how do you suggest we actually lobby the federal government? Where do we get our voice in to say that this is something they really need to get involved in?
Well, Minister Hellman is a very activist minister. I do believe that he is committed to significant reform. But I think it's important that you talk to your local MP, whoever he or she may be within the Greater Victoria area, and make sure that they understand that you're watching, that people on the call are watching, and they expect action on housing. We've had a lot of talk over the years, a lot of great ideas and report after report, but now it's time for money in partnership with the provinces. We're making strides with childcare with the federal government. We're trying to reform more funding for healthcare generally, of course, as a crisis, but we're doing so much together, I think, in a more effective way right now. This is just another area where we really got the federal government has to show up in British Columbia.
Fantastic. All right, let's turn to our next question. What will the province be able to do if municipalities refuse? Oops. We got halfway through that question. I'm not sure if we're going back to that one.
I can see it if that's helpful. Can you see it? What will the province be able to do if municipalities refuse to or fail to meet the targets for housing growth? What is on the table to force them to comply?
Fantastic. Thanks, Mr.
Great.
Eby. Over to you.
Take your job. I don't know why I can see it. Yeah, I saw it flick too. So I don't think we're quite at that stage yet. What we've done is a cooperative approach with municipalities to date. You must do a housing needs survey by this date. They have to have that housing needs survey complete by the end of this fiscal year, which is the end of March. One of the things, I'm hard on municipalities. I say, they need to be approving things faster. They need to be approving more housing. But one of the things that becomes apparent when you meet with a lot of municipal councils is these are folks, they want to do the right thing. They're next to volunteers. In many parts of the province, they're working another full-time job as well as being on council. And so that the voluntary piece of saying the compelling piece, you must do the housing needs survey, I think actually has been really positive for a lot of municipalities for that volunteer essentially on city council to say, oh, wow, I see now what it means when I say, I'm not going to approve that 3-unit complex in this community where each of them have 3 bedrooms, because I know from our housing needs survey that we need 100 3-bedroom units this year. And if I say no to this one, then where are we going to make it up? And so that information is really important. And I don't think we've exhausted the voluntary approach yet. But with that said, if you're particularly interested in this, the Opening Doors report outlines a number of different mechanisms that the provincial government could do to both incent and compel municipalities to approve necessary housing, because as I say, there are some municipalities that are quite public about their disinclination to allow any growth or allow any additional housing.
Thanks. And Mr. Rankin, what's the situation with our local municipalities here? How keen are they to make this change?
I would say to varying degrees, depending on the municipality. But I want to build on a couple points that the minister just made. These people are working hard. They're elected. They want to do the right thing. They're often doing this after a full-time job elsewhere. And let's be honest, it's not a glamorous job to sit into housing rezoning meetings until late into the evening. It's tough work, and I think we need to show them some respect. So obviously, I'm always in favor, as I know the attorney is, to find incentives for them to realize our common problem. And I think that they're rising to that occasion. So I hope that we will continue to have a good working relationship with them. The point I wanted to build on was this housing needs report. I must confess, I thought that, well, whatever, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but it is a big deal. I'll tell you why. Because you can't fix something unless you measure it first. What is the problem for middle housing, for poor, for different categories of housing in a given municipality? If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So that really is important. And the province stepped up with the money to do that, because our municipalities are underfunded. They only have a fixed budget, and they must balance their budget by law every year. So the more you pile on the plate, the more difficult it is for them to do their job. So the money was provided. And what this report will do in a given municipality is provide fodder for those people who aren't happy with them sitting on their hands and not responding to the challenge that the attorney has just presented in terms of supply. So that provides real information that we can use, those people who want to get change can use to incent that change.
All right, thanks for those answers. We'll go on to our next question. What is the constraint on ending the homeowners grant?
Yeah, I spoke on this on CBC, and somehow it ended up being used to suggest that I don't support using different tax mechanisms to address different forms of demand in the housing market. But I really, on this one, it's important. So in the hottest real estate market and the least affordable real estate market in British Columbia, 64%, which is Vancouver, 64% of people are homeowners. Then that number only goes up as you go across the province. Our government was elected on improving affordability for everybody. And so the constraint on ending the homeowners grant is actually that would be a very significant tax increase across the majority of British Columbia. And there's just not an appetite to do that. That wasn't why we were elected. That's not what we're focused on. But the homeowners grant is unfair. It's unfair to tenants. And and the reason for the grant was to encourage people to be able to afford a home, to buy a home, and all the benefits that kind of flow from that in terms of financial security, personal security. You own your home, and I don't think I have to explain that. But for tenants, and the reality is that more and more people are tenants and will be tenants for longer than historically. It's not fair that homeowners get this benefit and tenants don't. And so one of the things we committed to is that we would have a grant for tenants along these lines. And the Minister of Finance is working on that. We campaigned on that in the last election, and the Premier remains committed to that, and we will be delivering that. So that's the constraint, I would say, is that we're not interested in increasing taxes on families, especially at a time of affordability issues. But the caveat is that obviously it's unfair to people who are living in rental housing situations, and we're committed to addressing that unfairness.
I would just emphasize that there is effort to address the other side of the balance, as the attorney said, that the unfairness to tenants is well understood and there's work underway. But I also should say, representing a lot of seniors and people with disabilities, that last year, I didn't know this, but almost 40% of those who got these grants were seniors or people living with disabilities. What it does is provide a modest relief for eligible property owners. If that doesn't, we need to keep that in mind as well.
Great, thanks. Okay, let's go to our next question. How can students and student associations advocate for an increase in post-secondary debt ceilings in order to allow them to build additional student housing?
Well, I would say this counts, but I would also say, take the win. This was a successful campaign that was run for many years by post-secondary institutions and student unions, and our government was elected and implemented this because of the call by student unions and post-secondary institutions. So you've been successful in this, and in UVic, we are moving as quickly as possible to get more units open that are publicly funded. And also recognizing that many students will live in the private rental housing market as well. So pushing municipalities to open more rental housing will benefit students as well. So I would say, keep the pressure on, absolutely. But at the end of the day, I think you've been successful. We have done exactly this, and UVic is one of the biggest beneficiaries of that through 260 new units.
Great, thanks. Our next question.
Or pardon me, 620 new units. My number
620, a net gain, 830 altogether in the building, but a net
21 net new. That's the key number.
That's the key number. I guess just thinking, about that question itself. Are there incentives, and this is just my own question, are there incentives in place for developers, in fact, to build rental housing it seems to me in a market like Victoria, they're always focusing on the high scale up end market as opposed to building good quality rental markets. Maybe you make more money, but are there incentives in place for somebody to come and say, you know, rather than build the for sale units, I want to actually come in and build a rental market?
Yeah, I'm advised by developers that are in this market that because of low interest rates, because of low vacancy rates, that unlike any time before, this is a time where there's a huge demand for rental housing. In addition, there is an interest on the part of pension funds and insurance companies and others to have long-term stable investments like rental housing. So there's lots of capital that wants to build the rental housing at a market level. And the challenge has been, how do we allow that housing to be built? There's not enough resources in government to address the housing crisis just by public spending. So we need the private sector development to take place as well, and especially around rental housing. And that's the big conversation that I'm having with cities like those cities in the CRD, as well as in Metro Vancouver. We do have incentives in place for more affordability, where you're willing to commit to more affordability. We have the Housing Hub funding. The federal government has a similar program, as well as others, to incent additional affordability. But happily, there is a huge interest in building rental housing right now, but there's also a huge amount of frustration around actually trying to get the development permit to start construction.
All right, okay, thanks. So next question is around bylaws and regulations, and how much is there any plan? How much do bylaws and regulations around suites impact housing issues in the CRD, and would a region-wide relaxation around allowing suites help? And I think you both touched on this previously, but Mr. Rankin, you're the local.
I think this is a Murray question.
Well, I think quite a bit. And I'll give you an example that came to my mind. Somebody brought this to my attention the other day. You know, municipalities have all these arcane ratios for how much your ground that you own has to be covered by housing, but also has things like parking requirements. How much parking does your unit have to have? And in a world where you're right on a bus route, or you have quick access to UVic up Foul Bay on, you know, on a bike route path, why on earth are we living in a world still where those bylaws require so many parking spots? If we didn't have those, we could create a lot more units. That's just one example of a bylaw that gets in the way of doing the right thing. There are many others, but I think harken back to a different era where everything we're premised on sort of suburban type of growth. We're not trying to do that. We're trying to be more creative now. And bylaws as simple as parking requirements can get in the way.
Yeah, thanks. We got time for a couple more questions, I think. So let's go on to our next question. Is there any plans on how to deal with constraints in construction, like shortages of labor, so that they can meet housing needs?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So part of this solution is around trades training. And what you're going to see in the next year is a strategy from the Ministry of Advanced Education around Red Seal training and trades training for British Columbians. We've already done a lot of work on this through the Industry Training Authority, as bringing back apprenticeships and opportunities for people to learn these skills. We have a special new program for infrastructure development that requires, for major projects like Patella Bridge, for example, that requires a certain number of apprentice positions to be made available. And that also has requirements around portions of those apprenticeships being available to Indigenous people, to women, and to other groups that are underrepresented traditionally in the trades. One of the opportunities that's available for the province is that we have a significant number of people who are not currently working, but we have a huge number of jobs that need filling. And by supporting groups that are not traditionally in construction trades to get involved in these kinds of jobs, we think we're going to be able to close some of that gap. Obviously, it's not just construction where we're facing this issue. We understand that in the next 30 years, we're going to have a million more jobs than people. Immigration is going to be part of this response. We face shortages of people in the caring economy, whether it's in healthcare, in supports for supportive housing, social workers, that kind of thing, in biotechnology, in computer science, in really, you name it, we're seeing that generational shift that people were talking about many years ago, with many baby boomers saying, okay, I'm ready to retire. And that huge population group is creating a massive opportunity, but at the same time, a training gap that our province is going to have to fill. So you're going to see us continue to support more seats in post-secondary, more apprenticeships, and more training opportunities. I think that was a great question, Sean, and I'm really glad you asked it. Murray, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I think it's a terrific question. I just had a couple of additional comments. I want to just underscore what the attorney just said. I mean, when I was growing up, getting a job was going to be hard. Now there are more jobs than people. The number is 1 million more jobs in the next 10 to 20 years in British Columbia. And I'm happy to say 80% of those jobs will require some kind of post-secondary education. So going to university is a very wise choice. Getting a Red Seal and apprenticeship and getting into the trades, we've never had the demand that we do now. And there's a lot of good things going on at Camosun College and shipbuilding and all the other things. And as the minister said, Indigenous and women in traditional trades, it's really quite an exciting thing that's going on right now. But I think that I also wanted to, in addition to the point about the excellent question about shortage of labor, where we're getting it from other provinces. I was talking to a developer in Victoria who said, I think he said everybody working on his particular housing development was from Saskatchewan or Alberta. Like, just to give you some idea, there's a huge problem out there. You drive along the Pat Bay Highway, what do you see? Carpenters required, etc. So I think we also need to know that there's other parts of the world from which we can try to get quality trained people through our immigration program. And we need to be strategic as a province and as a country about making sure we get some of the people who want to come here with all those skills to offer.
Great, thanks. And perhaps if I can just add something for Sean, we're really excited as a post-secondary about the future. We've always focused on school leavers, kids coming out of school to go to university. And I think universities have a huge role to play in upskilling and reskilling the existing labor market to get the skills ready for where we're moving as a province or where we're moving as a country. And we're really excited about those opportunities that aren't the traditional degree that's granted when you're 22 years old, which is really important as well. But I think we've got to look at the province as continuing to build people's skills to move in the appropriate direction. So we're excited about that. Okay, our next question. With vacancy rates at an all-time low, from a planning perspective, how can we increase supply? Are there partnerships / roadblocks that need to be formed or removed?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So from a planning perspective, I think the opportunity that's here is for cities to have really comprehensive community plans, official community plans, where the zoning underneath those plans actually matches what the plan says. So cities go through these big multi-year processes of designing these community plans. Here's what we want our community to look like. Here's what kind of housing we want to allow here and there. And here's where the industrial area is and whatever. And then the zoning underneath is entirely inconsistent with that official community plan. And the cities use that opportunity to say on a site-by-site basis, okay, if you want it to be upzoned to match our plan, you need to contribute a certain amount of money, you need to contribute a park, you need to contribute affordable housing. All of that is a very positive thing that the developer should contribute to help pay for growth, pay for infrastructure, provide affordability, whatever. But the problem is that when you do it site by site like that, it takes forever. And some of these negotiation processes take up to 2 years. They're entirely unpredictable. If you want to build some housing and you buy a site, you don't actually know what at the end of the day you're going to be asked to pay by a municipality. Therefore, you don't know what your pro forma looks like in terms of developing the site as a rental building or as strata or whatever. And if the negotiation doesn't go well, what we see is developers walking away and saying, well, wait for the next city council. And so then that land, instead of being developed, waits for the next city council and maybe they'll try again later. Sometimes the developer gets the approval and then decides not to build. Maybe they want to wait and see if they can get a better deal later on. And so then the city's put a bunch of resources into a negotiation for a building that doesn't go ahead. And it's the worst of all worlds. It's not predictable, either for the city or for the developer in terms of what contributions are going to be made. It takes a long time. It's not predictable for the neighborhood. It's not priced into the land that certain affordability commitments are going to have to be made. And so people overpay for the land, which sterilizes it from future development. It's just like a really terrible system that has grown up that doesn't really work for anyone. And cities say, well, we can't have the zoning match the plan because if we do that, we lose the opportunity to have this negotiation. And I think we can address that issue. I think we can potentially look after that and make sure that that is priced into the land when somebody buys it. Everybody knows what the expectations are so that when you buy the land, it's already zoned for what you want to build. It's already in the community plan. You know what you're going to have to contribute to the broader community, and you can get your development permit and get started and shorten that timeline. So that's the big planning opportunity that I see. I'm sure there are lots of people who are way smarter about planning than I am. They can explain the 10 ways why that is not accurate. But it doesn't seem a lot more complicated than that to me. There are obviously issues around site by site. Maybe there's some 100-year-old trees. Maybe there's a heritage building. That these little nuances that need to be dealt with at the local level. But generally speaking, that to me seems to be the big planning and roadblock issue.
I would add a couple to that. If you, just to build on the first point of what the minister said, if a municipality has an OCP, an official community plan, as their blueprint, and if my proposed development is consistent with that, why do I have to do zoning? Like, let's cut it all out. And I think we're making strides in that direction, because otherwise you're just having to reinvent the wheel every time somebody comes forward. If it's consistent, there should not need to be a zoning hearing, period. So that's one part. Secondly, this may be more controversial, but there are certain parts of our city, often corners, where there used to be gas stations. And those gas stations might have had leaking underground storage tanks. They're called lust in the business. And it may not be that they really are contaminated to a degree where they can't be used for apartment building, for example. Oh yes, there may be there's different levels of contaminated site regulations that can apply, but I'm wondering if we are being strategic. I mean, building an apartment building on a corner is maybe different than having a lawn and exposed land. And I think sometimes we're a little bit too stringent. In other jurisdictions, they're less so. And therefore, we are often sterilizing some of our good inner city property from appropriate development. And those rules can sometimes, to use the expression, be roadblocks that need to be dealt with.
All right, thanks. And I think we're going to take one. We'll have this as the last question that comes up now. So people who rent a room in a house with a landlord are not protected under BC's RTA. What changes can we make to fix this to provide protection?
I think there's maybe some nuance to this question, but the core of it, that if you're living in a suite that is illegal and that the municipality can come and close down and kick you out without notice, then truly you're not protected under the RTA. There's some nuance here, and I would encourage people to get legal advice before assuming that they don't have any protections if someone's renting an illegal suite to them. I'll just say that as my public service message of the day. Because you may well have some remedies and some rights against a landlord renting an illegal suite to you, even if the city kicks you out. So I think that the core of the question for me is, how could it possibly be that a city doesn't allow secondary suites in the year 2020? Let me just check my calendar. 2022 in British Columbia. And I'm very grateful for the advocacy of my colleague Murray Rankin around this issue for your local community, UVic. And I think that, and I hope that provincially we may be able to find ways to move forward to legalize suites and address those very few communities where you're not allowed to rent out secondary suites. There is a reason for some suites to be illegal. Some suites don't have necessary safety in it, and they can become fire traps, and people can die in quite horrific circumstances because it's not safe. So we do need to have minimum standards, and there's an important role for municipalities to play there. But where it crosses the line, in my opinion, is around total bans and where it's not about safety, where it's actually about exclusion and maintaining a certain population in a community and excluding others, namely renters, from those communities. So thanks for that question. I think it's a great wrap-up question for Murray, because he's been such a champion of this around Oak Bay.
Thanks very much. I don't think I've anything to add. I think we really have to make progress on secondary suites. I'm confident it's going to happen in the near term. So perhaps by next year, students going to UVic won't be faced with the hurdles that they're currently faced with. But I think I just want to say the questions were extraordinarily thoughtful, and I really have enjoyed this session. Thanks for inviting us, Dr. Hall.
Yeah, look, I think thanks again to everybody for those questions. I think they have been great questions. People have had some great thoughts on these issues. And for me, it's really, I've learned a lot about the complexities of this whole topic. It's not a very simple thing to solve without pulling all these pieces in together. And I'd like to invite both of you ministers to provide us with any closing thoughts you may have or reflections on the conversation. So perhaps Minister Eby, any thoughts about the conversation today?
Yeah, thanks very much. Just reflecting on the diverse place of origin of a lot of our participants, I really encourage people to pay attention. There's municipal elections coming up in October, as well as when you're walking and you see one of those white signs in your community that says rezoning application, give it a read. And if it says that someone's trying to put more housing into your community, if you're struggling to find housing, then write a letter to City Council, support the housing we need, support the candidates that want to build more housing, that want to welcome more people into communities. And I'm very grateful for your interest. I saw that the majority of folks stuck this whole thing out, and I'm really glad for your level of interest. And thank you very much, Kevin, for coordinating this, and to the University of Victoria for hosting us.
Thanks, Minister Eby. And Minister Rankin.
Well, I also want to do the public service announcement about the upcoming elections. This is the time. And I want to say that some students at UVic have been, in fact, very much involved in the secondary suite issue in Oak Bay. They've written in, I've seen, to the local paper. They've been involved at City Council. And I just want to salute them for that kind of activism, because it's obviously going to benefit maybe not them, but fellow students down the way. My office, I am the member of the legislature for most of the area that you've covered. That was a pretty big map. I don't cover Kamloops or Vancouver, but many of the places like Saanich, Victoria, Oak Bay, I do represent. And I hope that my office door will be open in this crazy pandemic world. It's virtually open all the time, but it'll be open much more. It's on Shelburne near Mackenzie, close to the university, and I'd welcome people coming and speaking to me. The UVSS has been very good to keep me informed on what's happening on the campus, but I encourage other students to please look me up, and maybe we can work together to solve some of these problems. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Oh, great. I really want to take this opportunity to thank both you, Minister Eby, and you, Minister Rankin. I just the openness and honesty that comes out of you both is refreshing. I think you're both extremely knowledgeable on this issue and passionate about it. So, you know, we feel we're in a good place where people are being listened to. And sure, there's lots of challenges and problems ahead, but it's great that we're seeing some progress on that. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the UVic team that produced this today. It worked, you know, without any hitches whatsoever, as it always does with our fantastic tech team. And a big thanks to Sarah and Heather, our ASL interpreters, for some very hard work today. So on behalf of UVic, you know, this is an issue that touches many of us and really impacts us all. It really affects the overall health of our community. So we're looking forward to working together with government. We're looking forward to working with our student, staff, and faculty, and our neighbors in the community to tackle this really significant pressing issue for all of us. So thanks everybody for today, and we'll see you all again sometime.
Thanks so much.